In a game that is filled to the brim with unique fighters, it takes a lot to stand out. But for the Stockton-born legend and former Ultimate Fighter winner Nate Diaz, it was only a matter of time before he became the star he was born to be. And with his final UFC bout now set for UFC 279 and the fearsome Khamzat Chimaev in front of him, the time seems perfect to take a look back at the career of Nathan Diaz and figure out exactly what it is that makes him so special. This is the rise of Nate Diaz. Born to Mexican-American parents in California, Nate's early days were spent on the tough streets of Stockton, where he, along with his brother Nick Diaz, grew into their teenage years always looking over their shoulder. One day, at the age of 11, Nate was invited to train with his older brother in a nearby mixed martial arts gym, immediately finding new purpose in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and boxing. It was a fascination that would continue with him for the next 2.5 decades. Nate eventually came into professional fighting as a 19-year-old, and after a few amateur bouts, arrived on the scene with some real pressure on his shoulders. By the time he reached the Ultimate Fighter house, his brother had already knocked out Robbie Lawler and submitted Jeremy Jackson to post a 2-0 record in the UFC. Of course, the younger Diaz sibling came into the show as Nick's little brother, taking a spot on the 155-pound bracket. Nick wasn't yet the major star he would become in Strikeforce, but Nate still had some pretty big shoes to fill, especially after losing by way of armbar to Hermes Franca in his last fight. But if there's one thing that would be a constant through Nate's career, it's his ability to upset the odds. Diaz went 3-0 on the Ultimate Fighter reality series, submitting all of his opponents before winning the competition against Manny Gamburian. There's no doubt that his early form was pretty impressive, and in many ways, Nate was carving out a more consistent run than even Nick was managing at this point in time, winning 5 in a row in the UFC. Sure, he would end up losing his next 2 bouts against Clay Guida and Joe Stevenson, but even when his form was dipping, he was still bringing the action, earning 6 performance bonuses in 6 consecutive fights. But even though Nate was a talented fighter, showing excellent boxing and submission skills, he was still finding the right levels of form. And once he lost to his Ultimate Fighter rival Gray Maynard, he decided to leave the lightweight division, stepping up to welterweight. At this point, Nick had already left the UFC in favor of Pride, Elite XC, and eventually Strikeforce, and that left Nate free to try his hand at 170 pounds. The problem? Well, despite going 2-0 with a pair of pretty impressive wins, when the competition levels increased, it became very clear that this was not Nate's ideal weight class. Rory McDonald, in particular, dominated the younger Diaz sibling, throwing him around the cage with ease to the point that it was almost difficult to watch. Nate has always been known as a fighter who comes on strong late, but on this occasion, Rory was the one who picked up momentum, picking up a lopsided decision win. Following the loss, Diaz went back to the lightweight division, and he wouldn't make another welterweight appearance for the next 5 years. But this was just a temporary setback, and after getting a harsh lesson on the levels that exist at 170 pounds, Nate Diaz returned to his natural home with a vengeance, submitting Takanori Gomi and Jim Miller, while putting on a stellar performance against Donald Cowboy Cerrone. The worst part of Nate's time in the UFC, however, would start when he received his first and only shot at UFC Gold, a fight against the reigning champion Ben Henderson. Henderson was a real physical force in the division, and he showed every bit of that during his fight with Nate, hurting the challenger on several occasions, using constant leg kicks and his wrestling to dominate the Stockton native. Nate, as he usually does, resorted to taunting, but was unable to coax the champion out of his game. Diaz would ultimately lose every round to Ben Henderson, and for most of us, the fight stood as real proof of his limitations. Sure, at that point in time, he was a fun fighter and an incredibly dangerous finisher in certain areas, but coming up against someone as well-rounded as Henderson was a bit of a wake-up call about his ceiling. Watching him get finished by Josh Thompson via TKO, as well as manhandled by Rafael Dos Anjos the following year, certainly didn't help either. Sure, he picked up a nice win over Gray Maynard during this spell, but once he lost to RDA and Nate took a year out, we had no reason to expect his career to make a resurgence. Of course, we couldn't have been more wrong. At this point, Diaz had made it pretty clear that he was unhappy with his rate of pay, becoming a pretty major thorn in the side of Dana White in the process. If you wanted to divide Nate's career into 2 perfect halves, it's fair to say that the first half ended the moment he signed on the dotted line to face his next opponent, Michael Johnson. Underpaid, undervalued, and underappreciated, Nate felt like he was all of these things coming into that bout. But to say that this was the most impressive performance of his career up to that point would be a true statement on many levels. Not only did Nate Diaz outbox Johnson with beautiful striking, taunting him and putting on a great show for the fans, but when he took to the mic afterwards, he made a call out that would change his life forever.
Conor McGregor, you're taking everything I work for, mother. I'm gonna fight your
It was an instantly viral moment, and one that would set the stage for one of the biggest rivalries the sport has ever seen. When the promotion eventually called him and asked him to face McGregor on short notice, his days of cashing low paychecks were finally through. However, those who thought that Diaz would stand a chance against the featherweight champion were few and far between, even if the fight was taking place at 170 pounds.
McGregor, 100%.
I think Conor's the favourite in that fight, yeah, 100%.
Second round TKO by Conor.
I would say McGregor's gonna win.
There's no way in hell that Diaz is going to beat Conor McGregor. It's as simple as that. It just ain't gonna happen, you know?
After all, Conor was the guy with all of the momentum, and in the opening round of their UFC 196 showdown, it showed. He battered Nate in the early moments, hammering him repeatedly with left hands that would have dropped most fighters at 145 pounds. But they weren't fighting at 145 pounds, and Conor McGregor was about to get a major lesson on the durability of larger fighters. As the midway point of the second round came, Conor started to slow down, and Nate just wasn't falling like his previous opponents. When the fight's momentum swung, it was nothing short of insane to watch it unfold. Before he knew what was happening, Conor McGregor was getting swarmed, dealing with pressure unlike anything he experienced in the UFC before, or in Cage Warriors before it. One left hand in particular from Nate Diaz got a major reaction from Conor, forcing him to do the unthinkable, as he shot in for a takedown against the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. The move was clearly done out of desperation, and it would ultimately prove to be his undoing.
He's shooting for a takedown, and I'm like, oh, you're a wrestler now. You're a wrestler. I remember I'm the black belt in jiu-jitsu, and you're shooting on me now, so me and you know that this is a wrap. This is a wrap.
From there, Nate cut through his defenses with ease, eventually finding his way to the back. At that point, cinching up a rear naked choke was a mere formality. Conor was beaten for the first time in his UFC career, and Nate Diaz had finally arrived as a major superstar. It took him 12 years as a professional to reach this point, 9 years of which he spent fighting in the UFC. 25 bouts across both the WEC and the UFC were needed before Nate was finally able to have his shining moment. And sure, beating Conor McGregor was one thing, but when he got that microphone in his hands and let the public know that he wasn't surprised,
Hey, I'm not surprised.
an A-list fighting attraction was born. He has certainly had his ups and downs since then, but in the 5 years that followed, Diaz's career has been an absolute treat to watch. Even when he's losing to guys like Leon Edwards, Jorge Masvidal, and McGregor in the rematch, there's always something brought to the table, whether it's a built-in excuse or a huge moment or two that could have turned the tide. The question now is just how much Nate has left in the tank, and how much he'll be able to deal with the overbearing physicality and aggression of Khamzat Chimaev. It's a real do-or-die situation for Diaz, the final fight of his UFC contract. If he loses, he could well take on some pretty hefty damage in the process, both to his own health and to his brand when he becomes a free agent. But if he does the unthinkable and wins before leaving the UFC behind him, that would, without question, be the most Nate Diaz way possible to end his fighting career. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, please be sure to let me know by leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Apart from that, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.